The case of Michael Rafferty stands as one of the most disturbing and heart-wrenching criminal trials in Canadian history. It centers on the tragic abduction and murder of 8-year-old Victoria Tori Stafford in April 2009, a crime that shook not only the small town of Woodstock, Ontario, but the entire nation. For many Canadians, this case became a chilling reminder that even the most ordinary communities can become the setting for extraordinary evil. Tori's disappearance launched a massive search effort, fueled intense media coverage, and ultimately exposed the brutal actions of two perpetrators, Terri-Lynne McClintic, who lured the child from her school, and Michael Rafferty, who was later found guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. What made the case particularly horrifying was the level of manipulation, betrayal, and violence involved, carried out against a defenseless child who simply wanted to go home from school. The Stafford family's unimaginable suffering became a focal point of the trial, as prosecutors laid bare the shocking details of what happened in those final hours of Tori's life. For years afterward, the name Michael Rafferty would symbolize the worst aspects of human cruelty, selfishness, and moral corruption. While Canada is not immune to violent crime, cases involving children often generate the most intense public reactions, and the Stafford case was no exception. The story had every element that captured national attention: a missing child, a desperate family, a small community rallying together, and the eventual revelation of shocking brutality. But beyond the typical narrative of a tragic crime, the involvement of not just one, but two perpetrators created an especially chilling dynamic. McClintic, a young woman with her own troubled background, became a central figure when she confessed her role in luring Tori away, but it was Rafferty who was painted as the mastermind, the one who orchestrated and drove the acts of violence to their horrific conclusion. Unlike crimes of passion or impulsive violence, the Stafford case seemed premeditated, cold, and calculated. This calculated nature was what set it apart from many other child abduction cases in Canada. Media outlets extensively covered every development, from the initial disappearance to the day Rafferty received his life sentence. As reporters broadcasted updates from the courthouse, the public followed along, horrified but unable to turn away. For many, this case represented the ultimate betrayal of innocence, a violation so severe that it left scars across the collective Canadian psyche. Woodstock, Ontario, was, at the time, a modest town known more for its quiet neighborhoods and small-town charm than for violent crime. When Tori vanished, residents were stunned, almost in disbelief that such a crime could occur in their midst. Parents who once felt comfortable letting their children walk home from school or play outside unsupervised were suddenly gripped by fear and paranoia. Schools implemented tighter security measures, neighborhoods organized watch groups, and the community became hyper-aware of strangers. The Stafford case disrupted the sense of safety that had long defined Woodstock. For local law enforcement, the pressure was immense. They had to balance the need for a rapid investigation with the scrutiny of national media and a community demanding answers. Vigils were organized, purple ribbons were tied around trees, and volunteers from across Ontario came together in search of Tori. This communal grief and solidarity were striking, but they also underscored the horror that someone from outside, or worse, inside, the community had committed such an atrocity. Woodstock, like many small towns, was unprepared for the kind of media circus and emotional devastation that followed, and the Stafford case forever altered its identity in the eyes of Canadians. Before the crime, Michael Rafferty was not widely known to law enforcement. Born in 1980, Rafferty grew up with what appeared on the surface to be a relatively normal background, though later reports suggested instability and a tendency toward manipulation in his personal relationships. He was described by acquaintances as charming on the surface but with a darker, controlling side. Rafferty's history revealed patterns of unhealthy relationships with women, marked by emotional abuse and a sense of entitlement. He lived in London, Ontario, at the time of the crime and worked sporadically, without a consistent career path. Despite outward appearances, his life reflected a series of poor choices, failed ambitions, and a disturbing interest in violent pornography, which prosecutors later highlighted in court to illustrate his depraved mindset. Rafferty's personal life became a focal point during the trial, as investigators pieced together how someone with no obvious history of violent crime could escalate to participating in such a brutal act. Friends and family members of Rafferty would later express shock and disbelief at his involvement, but to prosecutors, his past behavior painted a picture of a manipulative man capable of extraordinary cruelty. As the case unfolded, one of the most pressing questions was how Michael Rafferty could appear relatively normal while harboring such violent tendencies. To many, he seemed like an average man in his late 20s, social enough to maintain friendships and relationships, but beneath the surface, there were red flags. Former girlfriends testified that Rafferty was controlling, emotionally abusive, and often manipulative. Some even described him as having a dual personality, charming and smooth in public, but cold and calculating in private. Investigators later discovered Rafferty's disturbing internet searches, which included violent and deviant pornography, further solidifying the portrait of a man obsessed with control and domination. These red flags had gone unnoticed or unconnected until after Tori's murder, but in retrospect, they painted a clear picture of someone spiraling toward violence. The tragedy lay in the fact that these signs, while alarming, were not unique. Many abusers exhibit such behavior without escalating to murder. What made Rafferty's case stand out was the extreme and calculated way in which he acted upon his darker impulses, dragging others into his orbit of cruelty and leaving devastation in his wake. Victoria Tori Stafford was just 8 years old when her life was tragically cut short. She was described by her family as a bright, energetic, and loving child who adored her pets and enjoyed spending time with her older brother, Darren. Friends and teachers at Oliver Stevens Public School in Woodstock remembered her as cheerful, friendly, and quick to smile. Like many children her age, she loved simple pleasures, playing with friends, watching her favorite TV shows, and exploring the world with an innocence that only children can embody. The suddenness of her disappearance, and the cruelty of her death, shocked people precisely because she represented every child, a symbol of innocence and hope. For her family, Tori was the center of their world, and losing her in such a horrific way became a lifelong source of grief. Her short life, tragically overshadowed by the circumstances of her death, became a rallying point for communities across Canada who mourned alongside the Stafford family. The Stafford family's heartbreak was compounded by the fact that, at the time of Tori's disappearance, her parents, Terri McDonald and Rodney Stafford, were separated. Like many families, they had challenges, but both remained deeply involved in their children's lives. Terri McDonald was criticized in the media for past struggles with drug use, which unfortunately placed the family under unfair scrutiny during the investigation. Meanwhile, Rodney Stafford emerged as a public figure, tirelessly campaigning for justice for his daughter, appearing in front of cameras with raw emotion that resonated with people across the country. The family dynamic, while imperfect, was one rooted in love for their children. Despite facing judgment, they united in grief, determined to see justice served for their daughter. The media coverage often focused as much on the family's pain as on the investigation itself, humanizing the tragedy and making Tori's case feel personal to millions of Canadians. On the morning of April 8, 2009, Tori Stafford went to school like any other day. It was a typical spring day in Woodstock, and nothing suggested that tragedy was about to strike. After classes ended, Tori was seen walking away from school without her usual chaperone. She had begged her mother earlier that week to let her walk home with friends instead of being picked up, a request that many children her age might make. For the Stafford family, this small allowance of independence would become a haunting memory. Tori never made it home that afternoon. Surveillance cameras later captured her walking with an unfamiliar woman, later identified as Terri-Lynne McClintic, away from the school. These images would become vital in the investigation, but at the time, no one realized that this was the last time Tori would be seen alive by anyone outside her captors. The use of Terri-Lynne McClintic as the person to lure Tori was one of the most disturbing elements of the crime. McClintic, only 18 years old at the time, was known to Rafferty and had a troubled background of her own, marked by drug abuse, neglect, and a cycle of violence. Prosecutors later argued that her role was to make Tori feel safe, as a child might be less suspicious of a young woman than a strange man. Surveillance footage confirmed that McClintic approached Tori outside her school and engaged her in conversation before leading her toward Rafferty's vehicle. For investigators and the public, this betrayal of trust was nearly as shocking as the crime itself. The idea that someone so young and female could willingly participate in such a heinous act challenged the public's perception of who could be a predator. McClintic's eventual confession revealed chilling details of how easily she manipulated Tori into following her, and how Rafferty was waiting to carry out the rest. Once inside Rafferty's vehicle, Tori was at the mercy of her captors. The car ride marked the beginning of her final hours, a period that prosecutors would later describe in harrowing detail during the trial. McClintic testified that Rafferty drove them out of Woodstock toward a rural area while she attempted to calm Tori. The prosecution argued that Rafferty's intentions were clear from the start, to abduct and assault the child. The contrast between the innocence of Tori and the cold calculation of Rafferty and McClintic was devastating. During the trial, evidence from Rafferty's cell phone placed him in specific locations along the route, supporting McClintic's testimony. For many following the case, the thought of Tori sitting in the back seat, frightened and confused, while the adults beside her plotted unthinkable violence, was almost too much to bear. It was a reminder of the sheer vulnerability of children and the cruelty of those who exploit that vulnerability. As Rafferty drove further away from Woodstock, the plan became clearer. Their destination was a remote, wooded area near Mount Forest, about 130 kilometers away. This isolation was deliberate, ensuring that whatever happened would remain hidden. McClintic later testified that Rafferty was in control throughout the drive, dictating where they would go and what would happen. The chilling detail of stopping at a Home Depot to purchase supplies, including a hammer and garbage bags, highlighted the premeditation involved. Surveillance footage from the store confirmed McClintic's account, showing her buying the items while Rafferty remained outside. This stop, mundane to other shoppers, was in fact part of a horrific plan that would soon unfold. It reinforced the idea that the crime was not a sudden impulse but a carefully orchestrated act of violence. When Rafferty and McClintic finally arrived at the rural field near Mount Forest, the true horror began. The area was secluded, surrounded by trees, and far from prying eyes. It was here that Tori's final moments played out. McClintic would later testify that Rafferty sexually assaulted the child while she stood by. In her own words, she admitted to participating in the violence, claiming that she struck Tori with the hammer to end her suffering. Rafferty, on the other hand, denied responsibility, attempting to shift the blame entirely onto McClintic. The truth, however, was that both played central roles in the crime. The brutality of the act, combined with the innocence of the victim, left Canadians horrified when the details were revealed in court. It was a crime so savage that many struggled to comprehend how two young adults could commit it. After the murder, Rafferty and McClintic attempted to cover their tracks. Tori's body was concealed under a pile of rocks in the field, left in a way that suggested little concern for discovery or dignity. Rafferty drove back to London as if nothing had happened, and both he and McClintic attempted to carry on with their lives. The casualness with which they tried to resume normalcy was chilling. Rafferty, in particular, continued to interact with friends and acquaintances, hiding the dark secret of what he had just done. Investigators would later argue that this lack of remorse was a key factor in understanding his psychology, a man who could commit murder and then return to everyday life without apparent guilt. For the Stafford family, however, the nightmare had just begun, as Tori remained missing and the community launched a desperate search for her. In the hours after Tori failed to come home, her family contacted police, triggering a missing child investigation. Amber Alert protocols were not immediately activated, as law enforcement initially believed there was not enough evidence to suggest abduction. This decision would later be criticized by the public, as many felt that time was wasted in those critical first hours. Volunteers quickly mobilized, distributing posters, organizing search parties, and canvassing neighborhoods. Media outlets broadcasted Tori's picture nationwide, turning her disappearance into headline news. The purple ribbon became a symbol of hope and solidarity, with thousands across Ontario wearing it in support of the search. The Stafford family appeared repeatedly on television, pleading for information, while police expanded their investigation. At that time, no one knew the horrific truth, that Tori was already gone. The initial search became both a rallying point and, later, a symbol of the pain of not knowing. The Woodstock community's response to Tori's disappearance was immediate and powerful. Strangers volunteered their time, businesses donated resources, and entire neighborhoods came together in the search effort. Vigils were held almost nightly, where prayers were offered and hope was shared that Tori would be found alive. The Purple Ribbon campaign became one of the most visible aspects of this solidarity, spreading far beyond Woodstock into cities across Canada. Parents began walking their children to and from school again, while schools implemented stricter pickup rules. The case tapped into a primal fear that any child, anywhere, could be taken without warning. The sense of vulnerability was overwhelming, and it fueled both compassion for the Stafford family and anger toward whoever was responsible. For weeks, Woodstock was not just a small Ontario town, it became the heart of Canada's collective grief, with the nation watching closely as the investigation unfolded.